get started here. Sorry for the audio issues. Okay, so I wanted to talk about identity in Web3. And when I initially started looking at this, I wanted to do a big survey of all of the different solutions for storing identity and working with identity. And what I kind of quickly realized was that I needed a better grounding in the fundamentals of what identity is on Web3 and how authentication works and how these things play together before I went to that larger conversation. And so this is the presentation that kind of came out of that. So it's not quite what I originally promised. I think there are a lot of interesting avenues after this, and I'll talk about those at the end. There probably shouldn't be a whole lot that's new in this. This is going to cover kind of a lot of old concepts, but I'm going to try to dig a little bit deeper. I'm going to try to illustrate some connections between those, or at least deeper, as deep as you can, like, 30 to 50 minutes. Try to illustrate some connections and kind of maybe give a better grounding for some decisions moving forward. Depending on how much time all the slides take, I may try to do like questions and some logical breaks. We'll just have to see. I didn't get a chance to rehearse this a whole bunch. As I was trying to mention before I started having audio problems, this presentation is in Rome. If you search for identity in Web3, it should come up. There's also a link in Voice Meta. And then I've also put all of my research notes in Rome. There's a link to those in Voice Meta as well. So with that said, let's get going here. Also, I had to, because this is about identity, I just had to share my ENS identity here, necopinus.eth. And that will, what that means will become clear in a little bit. So just to illustrate that there is nothing new under the sun, here's the TLDR of the whole presentation. So what are wallets? Wallets are just private public key pairs. We'll talk about what that means in just a moment. And all identity in Web3 is ultimately just about your wallet. Your wallet is your identity. Your wallet is your username. And authentication is just proving that you control the wallet's private key. And you do that by signing some piece of data. It doesn't actually really matter what kind of data you sign. There's a lot of different standards. I don't think we're going to have time to talk about all of the different variations there, but if you want to check my research notes, I talk about in MetaMask, there's like 6 different ways you can sign, different structured pieces of data that you can sign potentially. What's kind of interesting about this is, and the reason I moved away from talking about this being blockchain and more talking about this being Web3, is that none of this is actually about blockchain. It kind of comes from blockchain, but blockchain transactions are expensive, so people don't want to do them. And it turns out you can do all of the authentication, all of the identity work without doing blockchain. But blockchain does make some real world use cases a lot easier, and we'll talk about some of those as we go on. All right, so we're going to do a quick primer on crypto. Not crypto as in cryptocurrency, but crypto as in cryptography, because all of this is about cryptography. I suspect some of you are really familiar with this. Some of you may not. If you are math phobic, don't worry. The furthest we are going to get is like some light multiplication. We're not going to dig deep into the details, but I just want to make sure that we've got all of the major terms here. So public and private keys, these are basically just large integers with some sort of hard to determine relationship between them. What the relationship actually is determined by the cryptographic algorithm that you are using. But the point is that you shouldn't be able to know the public key and then be able to determine the private key. That's not always true in the reverse direction, which is one reason that private keys are private, but in some crypto systems, the difference is kind of arbitrary. What we generally do is we say public keys, those are for encryption, so you're encrypting to the private key, and for verification of signatures. It's how you know that the private key signed something. Private keys are the inverse of that. They decrypt data. So if something was encrypted with the public key, the private key decrypts it, and then they sign data for the public key. What's important to recognize here is actually that this relationship is symmetric because really the public key can encrypt to the private key and the private key can encrypt to the public key. It's mostly, again, about how that public key is derived and convention about which one's public and which one's private. Hashes are something that's very, very important in crypto systems. They get used everywhere. It's just a number, again, a long number that uniquely-ish identifies data. And there are hashing algorithms that can take gigabytes and gigabytes of data and turn it into this nice short number. It's not quite unique. You can imagine most hashes are like 256 bits. So 256 ones and zeros. And obviously gigabytes, and a byte is 8 bits, so that's like lots and lots of bits. So there can be hashes that are the same, and that's called a collision. Those are ideally rare if you can produce them reliably. A hashing algorithm is considered broken. It's why people tell you not to use, if you've heard of MD5, people say don't use it anymore because we can relatively reliably generate collisions, two files that have the same hash there. But all of crypto systems use hashes that are much stronger than that. And then a signature is, in the simplest sense, just the hash of some encrypted data. So it's this number that identifies the data that is encrypted with the private key. And so then what the public key can do is it can decrypt that hash. So now it knows that the private key was what sent this data, and then it can verify that the data sent has the same hash as what was encrypted. And then that verifies the integrity of the data. Sometimes signatures have other stuff appended to them. That can get important in these systems, and I'll talk about, I'll highlight when we need to worry about what that other stuff is. So what about public key cryptography in Web3? We mentioned already that all wallets are just public-private key pairs. All blockchains, at least all the ones that I've seen so far, are built off of what's called elliptic curve cryptography, and we're going to drill into that just a little bit here. Elliptic curve, there are lots of different what are called curves. Bitcoin and Ethereum use this one. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, SecP256K1. That name doesn't really mean a whole lot there. Solana uses curve 25519, which is actually really, really standard. Lots and lots of people use that. And when you talk about a curve in elliptic key cryptography, it's a curve on a graph, a two-dimensional graph, and then like a designated starting point. So they're all using the same reference point on the curve there, and that's defined in the spec. And we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. What is a private key in elliptic curve cryptography? It turns out a private key is just any integer, any one at all, in a 256-bit space that's defined by the curve spec. So it's really, really easy to generate a private key. You just pick a number, any number, and you've got your private key. So what's the public key? Well, that's where it gets kind of fun. And here we're going to see what curves look like. So in elliptic curve cryptography, the public key is defined as a point on the elliptic curve, so that your defined starting point, multiplied by the private key. This is where we're going to talk about addition and multiplication really fast. So we're not actually doing addition and multiplication the way you would think about it, though. There's a special kind of addition that is defined in elliptic curves that's illustrated by the 4 diagrams I have below here that I've shamelessly stolen from Wikipedia. We are particularly interested in the second case here because this definition of q plus q, well, that's 2 times q. And so that can tell us what does 2 times q mean. But it's a lot easier to understand what's going on in elliptic curve addition if we think about the first case. So I want to just show that really, really fast. So what's happening when you add 2 points here? We've got this diagram here. I'm going to let it finish up. So we go A plus B, that's equal to C. C plus A, that's equal to D. A plus D, that's equal to E. What you do is you draw a line through the 2 points on the curve that you are adding. You trace that line out to, and you find the intersection, the third intersection might be between them, might be at one of the ends, and then you reflect that to the other side of the curve across the x-axis. And that's what addition is here. So that's how you add 2 points on an elliptic curve. When you're trying to just multiply a point, what you say, this q plus q case, what you're saying is you're going to take the tangent of the line at that point. So what's happening in all of these is that we are starting out at a defined point. We're taking a tangent to the curve at that point, finding the intersection with the curve, and then we're repeating it. We're flipping over to the other side of the x-axis, and then we're drawing another line from that point to our defined starting point that's defined that everybody uses, and then we're finding the next intersection and then flipping that across the x-axis. And we do that the number of times that is our private key. So if our private key is 10 million, we do that 10 million times. And it turns out that that process is also really, really easy to do. But even if you know the curve, even if you know the starting point, even if you know the end point, it's actually really, really difficult to figure out how many times you multiplied that starting point to get that final public point. So it's really, really hard to figure out the private key from that public key. And that's what makes this a really good crypto system here. What's also really cool is because we have a defined curve, we don't actually need to know both numbers for the public key. What we actually only need to know is the number on the x-axis for the key, and then whether it's above or below. So they call that, I think, a parity bit in this. So a 0 or a 1. So you just append that. And so that has the interesting consequence that all of the public keys in elliptic curve cryptography are 1 bit longer than the private keys, which is kind of a little unusual there. So that's how you figure out public and private keys in elliptic curve cryptography. What's also important is hashing. Blockchains love themselves some hashes. Hashing is really fundamental. We talk about when blockchains are creating new blocks, they're hashing them. Oftentimes when you're verifying things, you're signing hashes of something. When you make a transaction to move coins, you're signing a hash of that transaction. Bitcoin and Solana use a very tried and true hash, SHA-256. If you look on your computer, you will have a tool that does this. This is really a really vanilla. It's standardized. Every US government uses it everywhere. Solid choice there. Ethereum uses a newer hash called Keccak-256. It became SHA-3, but SHA-3 isn't really used so much anywhere. Keccak is really, really weird. I have to, it's hard to, I can't really tell you how weird it is adequately. It is the weirdest mathematical algorithm I have ever looked at there. So again, here, big blockchains love their hashes, and I think this is a little too much. Like you start reading about these, and like you're hashing, you're doing hashes of. We're going to run into a hash of a hash in a moment. There are cases where hashes are being used in ways that actually make things less computationally efficient, and not in like security-minded ways. In like we're just going to hash this thing and then make the other side recompute the original data. I'm not really sure what's going through people's heads. It feels very much like, when all you have is a hammer, we're going to have, when all you have is a hashing algorithm, we're just going to hash that thing.
Is there any advantage using the Keccak 256?
Well, it's a newer hash that is, like I said, it became SHA-3. It's not, SHA-3 is not the same as KEKAK 256, but they're very, very close. It's theoretically maybe a little bit more secure. There's some questions, though it's in dispute whether it's quantum resistant. I don't really see a practical reason. I think it was like the new hotness at the time that Ethereum was being put together. But in retrospect, I think sticking with SHA-256, and you're going to see this. I was going to bring this up a little bit later. Solana is kind of interesting because it uses vanilla curve. It uses SHA-256. You're going to see in a moment when I talk about wallets, it uses a much simpler wallet address representation. Solana, it feels like somebody said, "What if blockchain but not weird?" Like that's the only way I could describe it at this point, having done this research. Like both Bitcoin and Ethereum have like legitimate but kind of bizarre design decisions behind them, and Solana just like basically just undoes those all the weird design decisions. All right, so let's talk about wallets. As I mentioned earlier, a wallet is just a public-private key pair. So you would think that a wallet address would just be the public key. It's the public key. You can share it anywhere. That's the point of it being a public key. Except you'd be wrong. Pre-2017, Bitcoin addresses were the public keys. They were encoded with something called base 58, which is lowercase a through z, uppercase a through z, 0 through 9, but it takes out 0, uppercase O, uppercase I, and lowercase l, so sort of your look-alike characters. So it winds up 62 minus 4, that's 58 there. In a weird way, if all cryptocurrencies, if all blockchains evaporate tomorrow, I think base 58 might be like the thing that sticks around and is like important from all of this. Tons and tons of things use base 58 now. But after 2017, Bitcoin switched to a different wallet address representation. They are now SHA-256 hashes of SHA-256 hashes with a checksum and a version component. They use this weird encoding called Betch32, which, as far as I can tell, nobody else uses. And all I can think of was that Bitcoin was trying to out-weird Ethereum's choice of KEKAK 256. Ethereum addresses use KEKAK 256 are also a hash. They use KEKAK 256 hash of the public key because Ethereum just uses KEKAK 256 everywhere. But they're not the whole hash. They're actually only the last 20 bits of the hash. Why? Because, I don't know, 20 bits looks good. And they're just a big hexadecimal, tend to be represented as just a big hexadecimal number. So 0 through 9, A through F, base 16 there. Solana still uses just the straight public key. So if you have a Solana wallet like Phantom, you look at the wallet address, that is base 58 encoding of your public key. So if you went and you figured that out, you would actually see what that encoding represented. You would actually see the number that was your public key there. So that's the theory behind wallets. And in the beginning of Bitcoin, this is all wallets were. But we use things like browser-based wallet. We're using MetaMask. We're using Phantom. I mentioned on the channel that Brave Wallet is now on iOS, which I think is kind of exciting because I want to get something nice on my iPad to play with web3 sites with. None of those, all those are a little bit more complicated. All those are what are called hierarchically deterministic wallets. You might also hear these called HD wallets. So they start, and a lot of times you'll hear about people talking about the seed phrase with this. And that everything, that's what you need to keep your 12 words or your 18 words or your 24 words. That's what you need to keep secret. Except your seed phrase is not your wallet private key. Your seed phrase is actually just an initial secret plus a checksum of that secret to make sure you typed it in right. What's going on in hierarchical deterministic wallets, and this is blatantly stolen from the the proposal that defined hierarchical deterministic wallets, is that your secret key, so what's S here, is lengthened using a secure method, and then split into an initial internal public and private key, which is called the master node. And then subsequent nodes are derived from that. So subsequent wallets, and they're derived depending upon either the public or private key at the previous level. If you use the private key, you say that the derivation is hardened. If you use the public key, it is not hardened. There is the difference is that in the way the algorithm works, if you use that public key, then if a private key is exposed at the next level, and you know what the key was at the level before, the public key was at the level before, you can actually compute all of the other wallets at that particular level, all of the other public-private key pairs. Whereas if you use the private key, so this the hardened derivation, the disclosure of a wallet public-private key pair at a given level does not compromise the other wallets at that level. So that's the difference between hardened and not hardened. Hardened tends to be represented by appending a prime. So you'll see things will be like m/1 prime, and that means it's that first node, the firstish node. It's all zero index, so it's actually the second node on that first depth, and it was derived in a hardened fashion, so derived from the private key of the node before there. And then so you get this big tree here. So you can generate lots and lots of wallets here. And this was like super flexible, but it was immediately like too flexible. And so instead, what happened is people very quickly came down and tried to standardize what the different levels meant. And this gave rise to what are called key wallet paths. Public-private key paths. And so in most cases, in MetaMask, in Phantom, in the Trezor, the vast majority of hardware wallets, all sort of use this sort of standardized path here. So you start with your master key pair, the next node is 44, and that just refers to the proposal that standardized these things. The node down from that, the number will vary depending upon the cryptocurrency you're using. So 60 is used for Ethereum cryptocurrencies, 0 is used for Bitcoin, 501 is used for Solana. There's a big registry, and they're all in there. You then see a 0, then a 0 or 1. Bitcoin sometimes uses 1 at that next level, or that penultimate level, but basically almost all the actions at the zeroth node. And then your actual wallets are 6 derivations down from that this path from that initial seed phrase there. So one interesting thing here is you'll notice that the step up from the wallets is not hardened. So it is there is a potential to compromise all your wallets if one of those wallets is exposed. That's Ethereum and Bitcoin don't harden that. Solana, again, being slightly more sensible for whatever reason, does derive that node in a hardened fashion. So that's the big difference between the path between Ethereum and Bitcoin on the one hand and Solana on the other. That said, all of this wallet key material is stored in a single file on your computer, and it's encrypted with whatever password you saved you used when you set up the wallet. So even though Solana is technically more secure here, I don't think in practice there's much of a difference between these. So that's what a wallet looks like. So you've got this big chain. Your seed node, your seed phrase is actually at the beginning of this chain. It's all deterministic. Everything is determined by these numbers, which is why if you type in that seed phrase in MetaMask, you can generate the same wallet keys, the first one, the second one, third one. It's always the same order. It's always the same wallets, and you can restore them that way because it's all tied in here to this wallet path, and that's all standardized. So that's our wallet. That is our identity. We now can see how our identity is derived, what's going on here. Sorry. My timer locked. Okay, we can see what's going on here. But so what's happening with authentication? So as mentioned, in Web3, wallet is your identity. Authentication, as I mentioned at the beginning, is just proving that you control the private key of that wallet. And how do you do that? Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, you just do that by signing some data from the website. Typically, you do have some security concerns around that data. You want it to be non-repeatable. You don't want somebody to be able to capture that transaction and send it back to the website. So it generally includes what's called a nonce, not only once. So just some number that is only ever used one time to just identify that. In Ethereum, this is where that other stuff that's attached to the signature becomes important, because Ethereum signatures actually are self-verifying. Ethereum attaches the public key to the signature. So when you go to a site with MetaMask, the site can just hand you data. You sign that data with your wallet, with that private key. That's what's going on. You haven't touched the blockchain at all, so it doesn't cost you a thing. You hand that back to the website. The website can immediately see from that signature what your public key is, that the signature is valid, and it can compute your wallet address from that. So it knows who you are. So that simple action where the website hands you something, you sign it, you hand it back in Ethereum, that's all you need to completely sign in. You've specified and authenticated your data in this really nice bundle. So, I actually suspect that particular property may be one reason that Ethereum has really, one of a couple of different reasons that Ethereum has really caught on, because it really does make a lot of this handoff process with signing a lot easier if the public key is following along with the signed data. I think very smart choice on Ethereum's part. I think it's worth noting here that proving identity by signing some data is not a new concept at all. I think it's worth talking about some antecedents here. If you've used Firefox in a corporate setting or Internet Explorer, you may be familiar with using certificates to authenticate yourself to a website. You don't see that a lot in the consumer context, but the browsers can actually store private SSL TLS certificates that are issued by a certificate authority. One of the same people who secures websites. They're just for you. They identify you. They cost you money. They're signed by the CA. There's generally something like you have to show them driver's license or something like that for it. And you can sign in with that. And that's a similar process to what's going on here. SSH, if you've used that, is a kind of a similar process to what's going on here. If you've used Gemini, if you've played around a little bit with that side of the internet, sort of the radical rejection of all these things, the way Gemini handles identity is it generates TLS keys directly in the Gemini client and uses them sort of in this much more ephemeral way. It uses a process called TOFU, trust on first use. So it's the same kind of idea. It's like you're just presenting this public part of the certificate, because a certificate is, again, basically a public-private key pair. Technically, it's the public part with a little bit more information, but you have the private part of that. You're just presenting that certificate. You're showing that you can sign the data that corresponds to that public key. So nothing is new here. What's kind of new about this is that Web3 is kind of taking a middle ground. So it's not being like you have to go through a centralized authority like the old certificate authorities, but it's not being this sort of like hyper paranoid Gemini, there's not really a way to, they don't make it easy to necessarily export certificates. The idea is that Gemini sites shouldn't even be using these things except in certain circumstances. So they're very ephemeral. And Web3 is saying, well, what if this wasn't more ephemeral, but we were still using this technology? So it's kind of staking out a middle ground, if you will, between the way we've done things and like some of the extreme reactions to it. So how does a website know that you can sign in? It's because MetaMask actually injects, or Phantom actually injects JavaScript, a JavaScript library into the page. It exposes a function, and so the page just says, hey, do I have a function available in this Web3 library? If I do, go and see if I can sign data with it. And that's how that works. But you could imagine, like, if every wallet had to inject JavaScript into a page, that could get pretty messy. There would be conflicts between wallets. So you kind of wish there was a better way to do this, and there is. Enter Wallet Connect. So Wallet Connect is taking this authentication process and it's it's adding a little bit of complexity to remove the need for code injection there. The basic Wallet Connect process, there's a lot more that's going on, but this is sort of the high level, is the site that goes and encrypts some payload and uploads it to a proxy server. Wallet Connect's called these bridge servers. And then either through a QR code or through a deep link into the wallet app, so using for on mobile, a link into a mobile app on the Connect, it exposes to the wallet what is the proxy connection location and what is the secret key that was used to encrypt the data. The wallet then goes to the proxy, grabs the data, decrypts it, signs it, pushes it back to the proxy, and then the site can go and grab that and do the whole verification process that we just talked about. That process also establishes a secure channel between the wallet and the site because an encryption key has been exchanged there. So that's Wallet Connect 1.0. That's what basically we use everywhere. Wallet Connect 2.0, which is in the works, is a bit more complicated than this, but it's doing what it does. That complication is getting us is it's getting us some more secure encryption. It's moving to ephemeral public-private key encryption, so per connection public-private key pairs on both sides. It's also removing some Ethereum-specific assumptions. There's some assumptions embedded in Wallet Connect that public key is kind of moving along with the signature. Wallet Connect 2.0 is removing that so that you could do things like use Bitcoin to sign in, your Bitcoin wallet to sign into a website, for example. In many ways, Wallet Connect 2.0 is another example of how the implementation of identity in Web3 is trying to strike a middle ground between sort of these older centralized approaches and more of these ephemeral approaches, because it's moving away from the authentication where like you have a Google account, you're going to sign in with Google, or you have an Apple account, you're going to sign in with Apple or something like that. But it's not, again, it's not being this sort of hyper local authentication that like Gemini uses. It's taking this middle ground and it's saying, what if we put like the actual important stuff on the client side, but we still allowed things to coordinate here. So again, I think this is a recurring theme here of trying to kind of strike the middle ground. So that's authentication. So I wanted to just quickly talk about some problems and solutions in this space here. So one is identity on Web3 isn't very friendly. Wallet addresses, like they're kind of logged. They're not really human meaningful. They're just like random numbers and stuff. So how do you make these human friendly? And you can do that using DNS-like systems, generally rooted in the blockchain. There's a lot of these. There's the .eth ones, which the Ethereum name service. When you saw at my title slide, necopinus.eth, that is a Ethereum name, the ENS name that is tied to a Ethereum wallet address that identifies me. Solana has something similar that's run by a company called Bonfida, called Solana Name Service, .sol. There's also .crypto, which supports a lot of things. It's out of Unstoppable Domains. There's a few others, including one I'll mention at the very end, which is very, very different, and I think would be a great thing if somebody else wanted to look into it. ENS is very, very widely supported already. If you have an ENS name, you'll notice that it will show, your friendly name will show up in things like Gnosis Safe. It'll show up in things like MetaMask. It's widely used. You can even take Gnosis Safe's addresses and give them Ethereum names. So we could have a Yak Collective.eth that pointed to our Gnosis Safe, for example. Notice here, this is the first time we've actually done anything that requires blockchain. And what we're using blockchain for is as a verifiable registry of these things. It's going to blockchain as a public ledger. So this is sort of the first place that that's coming in, and it's that ledger that's important. Finkat's pointing out that MetaMask ETH already exists and points to our MetaMask. So great. I'd forgotten totally about that. Another problem here is it's really easy to lose control of wallet-based identity. You can just lose them in a computer crash. You can back up the key, your shared key. You didn't back it up securely, and somebody robbed your house and got your shared key and now has your identities. So this is sort of a little bit more editorial, but you can actually use multi-sig vaults like Gnosis Safe as an individual as a way of securing your identity there. So one thing you could say is I'm trying to do recovery. So you could imagine a 1 out of 2 vault, Gnosis vault safe. And you'd use, say, with MetaMask and maybe a hardware wallet, or 2 different wallets on 2 different browsers. And now if you lose control of one, you still have the other you still have this other wallet, and you root your identity in the Gnosis Safe rather than in any of these wallets. So you treat the wallets more as internal private authentication mechanisms, and your externally facing thing you make Gnosis Safe. If you wanted to make really high security, you could make, say, a 2 out of 3 vault. Use, say, MetaMask and 2 hardware wallets, and I don't know, send a hardware wallet to your folks or a friend, or store it in a safe or something. That way, any transactions that are going to manipulate your identity require an extra layer of authentication there. So this is something. It's a little bit trickier. It's a little bit more expensive to do. I'm personally playing with it, but I can't actually say that I'm fully in here already. But I've definitely become convinced in my reading that this is kind of a good direction if you're going to spend a lot of time in this space to go. Your identity is very, very important, and to try to root that in something that is a little bit harder to lose control over. So that's all very interesting. Far be it from me to leave us on an up note. I did want to end on a little bit of a downer, because there's this question of, can we apply this to the quote unquote real world, to the physical world? Can we apply this retroactively, graft this onto sort of the Web 2 world? Can we bridge Web 2 and Web 3? And it turns out that the answer to all of this is yes, but it's probably not happening. And that is, the sad tale of DIDs, otherwise known as Web 3 at the W3C. So DIDs are still a proposal for distributed identities from the W3C, so the consortium that determines web standards. And commits, I noticed you had made a note in the online governance channel about some questions about W3C governance. And I think this kind of maybe plays into some of that. So it might be kind of an interesting story there. DIDs can be used kind of everywhere. I talk about them being a bridge, but they're actually way more than that. And they weren't necessarily originally designed to do that. They're sort of designed as a general a way of porting around cryptographic identity. You could use them for website and app login. You can use them for verifying identities, other identities, and verifying documents on the chain. You can use them for lots of things. And the reason they do kind of provide a bridge there is that there are methods, though you're sort of discouraged from using them, where you can tie old school I think commits is correcting me here that they are identifiers and not identity here. I think that's a good distinction to make, but I also think that the difference between an identifier and an identity is kind of it's a little fuzzy around the edges. So you can think of DIDs are identifiers. You could say the DID document is also sort of an identifier. It's pointing to some amorphous thing that is an identity. It is trying to do a wider thing than just identity, as commits is mentioning here in the chat here. But I think it's very much based around sort of when you read through the spec, it reads like, well, how can we take wallets, this wallet process, and push that, make that available more broadly there. One thing with DIDs is that they don't require blockchain again. They're really just about exchanging cryptographic identifiers. But blockchain, again, solves a lot of real world problems because you have questions about, these identifiers can change, who controls them can change, what cryptographic material they include can change. So if you have some sort of verifiable register, what they call a verifiable registry, really just an immutable ledger that includes, can include these DIDs, can include things like verifiable credentials, which is a different W3C spec. What you can do is you can use sort of the chain time in that to determine, hey, were these things aligned? Did the DID contain the key material that signed this particular credential or this other document at the time the signature was made? And if you don't have that ledger, then you really have to invest a lot of trust in some other centralized store. Anyway, DIDs you can do a lot with them. It's kind of, this is where I ended, and I wish I'd had a chance to read a little bit more about them, and it sounds like commits may actually have a much better sense of what's going on here. I kind of suspect that DIDs are probably dead at this point. The Apple, Google, and Mozilla all objected to the spec when it came up for approval late last year. There's kind of an arbitration process right now that seems to be going on around that. Google and Apple, as far as I can tell from reading about the objections, seem to basically be playing no true Scotsman on the spec. And this is like Google, as commits is mentioning here, Google and Apple both have big ID businesses. Google and Apple also are in the process of rolling out their own credential infrastructure. Apple's been pushing like in-state IDs in their thing, and that credential infrastructure uses a very different model than the verifiable credential model that W3C is looking at, which also is sort of like very adjacent to DIDs. So Google and Apple definitely have kind of a reason against that. Mozilla's objection was basically blockchain encourages carbon use and is therefore in violation of ethical principles. They also had some more technical things. The thing is that even if this is resolved, these are all of the browser manufacturers, and it's hard to see DIDs actually happening without browser support there. Yeah, and as commits is mentioning, and as I thought I mentioned, but I will reiterate, DIDs are written in a way that is completely agnostic to blockchain. The implementations that are out there, the majority of them do use blockchain for the verifiable ledger, but there's no reason that you can you have to use blockchain there. They're written in DIDs is written in an extremely agnostic fashion. So this was sort of like coming in. It's sort of the doesn't really coming in at the end here, and sort of an interesting note of where this started to maybe get formalized and standardized in a broader sense, and then that did not unfortunately happen. Some future directions, things I didn't get to. It would be great, and I might try to get to these. I'm not sure I'm going to have time to do this in the next season, just because I have a lot going on in my personal life. But I think these would be great things for somebody else to pick up. I'll do something in here if I can. One is I think it'd be great to do a deep dive into how the naming systems are actually, blockchain naming systems are actually working. How does .eth work? How does .sol work? Those sorts of things. There's also a different approach to identity that's rooted in Namecoin, name ID, which seems, at least from a passing reading, very different than some of the more wallet-centric identities. I don't have my head around that really well, and that might be wrong, but it would be interesting to just look into that for something that's very tangential, because this has been a very sort of Ethereum-centric conversation here. It would be good to really dig into multi-signature smart contracts like Gnosis Safe. Like, how do these actually work? What are the mechanics of these like? Ceramic Network seems to provide a lot of the functional pipeline for many identity implementations that sort of extend identity, sort of storing data around user accounts. There's, if I recall, there's actually a DID method that's tied to Ceramic in the protocol. So I think doing a deep dive into Ceramic would actually be really, really useful. And then finally, I ran into something recently on Twitter. There's somebody talking about soulbound NFTs. I have no idea what these are, but like people were kind of pushing these as potentially an identity thing. So that might be an interesting, is like, what is going on here, and do we care about these question. So I think that's kind of future directions here. We're almost out of time, but I just want to say, again, resources, these are both on Rome. These are just links because the Rome links went off the side of the page, but just search for identity in Web3 for this presentation. My research notes can all be Web3 identity research notes. Those are both, again, linked in Voice Meta. All right, and we've got like 3 minutes, but that's me.
That was very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. Hopefully, again, I don't think there was like a lot of new stuff here, but I'm hoping that there's a lot of like context and looking at antecedents that can be kind of help us think about things in a little more precise of a fashion as we're trying to decide which technologies we want to explore further.
So one thing that struck me in the last part, where the browsers are kind of killing an attempt to connect this to Web 2, is the earlier discussion we had in the sort of survivalism thread of around passwords, and how actually the best passwords are like 10, 12 words long, like ordinary natural language sentences. But somehow the security industry has drilled into us a very sort of vulnerable sort of habit of picking short but incomprehensible and unmemorable word things with weird special characters and stuff. So it seems like we're going down a similar suboptimal path here, where in fact the easier habit would be easier for consumers to adopt, but because of like entrenched interests plus a mix of like ignorance and weird biases, we might go down a path of a much weaker scheme.
Yeah, I think that's a real worry. I mean, that said, it's kind of a little bit on the other side. The there are some real problems with, in practice, people keeping the security of their wallets. I mean, we hear about people losing their seed phrases all the time, and those are all, I think, soluble, but like there really needs to be some like UX people, but more UX people working on the Web3 side, because like it's just not a good user experience right now. And I think that's also a barrier to adoption. But I think the parallel with passwords is very strong. Even the U.S. government now officially is saying, long and strong, and don't even bother rotating it, because when people rotate passwords, they just choose weak ones again. But yeah, I mean, diceware passwords, or things sort of like the XKCD method, which is kind of generalized diceware, are, I mean, essentially it's the same idea as behind generating those seed phrases. It's encoding a really, really, really long random number as words, and as humans, it's easier for us to know words. The trick is with long and strong is you don't want to use sentences, because when you have grammar, it really kills the entropy of your thing. So you do need to be more of a diceware, actually choosing random words there. But those are still, yeah, easier for people to remember, and there's a real activation energy. It's really, there's a real path dependence in these things, and it's unfortunate.
All right, we're at 9 o'clock, and I believe we have nothing on the schedule for next week. So if somebody wants to grab the session, please do so. If not, what we can do is do a sort of shared brainstorm discovery around the stablecoin Luna thing, which I think we should make an effort to wrap our minds around. So that's kind of tentatively on the calendar, but if you want to bump that for some topic you want to lead, please propose.
All right, I gotta hop off. Thanks, everyone. See you next
Thank
week.
you.